Do you mind? I'm just looking at the volume. Do you mind if I put it right up next to you? Because it's not a problem for me because I speak super loudly.
Sorry.
So I just shout basically, and so I can just stand here.
I can start.
And it will pick up the same volume.
I will.
You see, already that's much better. Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Thoughts. My name is Hamish Stewart. Today on the show we have Quan Nguyen, who is a PhD candidate at the University of St Andrews. Quan is currently finalising his philosophy PhD on the rationality of time biases and temporal neutrality. More importantly for this episode though, he has recently started a job as a coordinator for the COP26 coalition, which is a civil society alliance organising for the UN Climate Summit next year in Glasgow. He's also been a working group coordinator within Extinction Rebellion Scotland and writes philosophy articles for public engagement. Today on the episode, we talked about rational responses to climate change and about climate change political movements. In the second half of the episode, we talked about Extinction Rebellion. Here are some thoughts on rational responses to climate change and Extinction Rebellion. You wrote this article named Fear and Anger Are Rational Responses to Climate Change. In what was the publication?
In The Conversation.
In March 2019.
Mm-hmm.
What was your argument there?
So, I guess, let me say something about the context there first. So, at that time, the school strikes really, went off. School strikers, climate change. And there was a lot of debate and criticism about this, that these school children are gambling with their future. They should not be so hysteric about it. They should just be reasonable and rational about this. They should just go to school. I think Theresa May said that quite famously, if you care about climate change, go to school. And all over Europe, politicians have said that, and in the US I think too. And that kind of upset me quite a lot because firstly, it's super disrespectful to young school children who care about the future, but secondly, it's a wrong use of rationality, and it's a ideologically driven misuse of rationality as a concept, and that's why I wanted to write this article.
And the reaction you were saying was not irrational, was fear and anger in particular, wasn't it?
Yeah, so school children are afraid of climate change, right? And they're angry at government inaction, and that's a perfectly rational response. And anyone who says, "Oh, you should be reasonable, you should be more rational about it, be more grown up," is kind of silencing these voices and these concerns, and which is a form of injustice in self, but it's also just not accurate, because if you think about rationality, rationality is quite a complicated thing. There's different forms of rationality under which you can put these kind of responses of anger and fear and outrage, and I think under all of them the school strikers' reactions have been quite rational. Let's talk about the different types of rationality. Mm-hmm. Earlier you were saying there were three. Is that how you like to look at it, or? Yeah, so I think if you talk about rationality, you can talk about it in terms of appropriateness. So are you responding correctly to facts and reasons out in the world? Say you see a bear coming towards you, and the bear is dangerous, and then you can have an appropriate reaction towards that, and have fear and a fear-driven response. That is an appropriate reaction, and in that sense fear is rational. But it can also be a form of coherence, so that is another form of rationality, so it can fit into your other beliefs. So for example, if you are sad about a species dying out, something that can fit in together with other beliefs you hold about the value of life, biodiversity, stuff like that. And in that sense, an emotional response can also be rational in terms of coherence. Yeah, and these two are often called the two faces of rationality by people in the field. And already in these two senses, fear and anger about climate change are absolutely rational, because you have a big dangerous pattern of events coming towards you, and if you would not be afraid of the consequences, you would actually be quite rational, I think. You would either not know all the facts, or if you would know all the facts about climate change, how catastrophic it can be and how dangerous it can be, then you should have some kind of emotional response, and fear is one of the most appropriate responses to that. and it is also coherent for school children who care about their future, who care about human life, who develop like a political consciousness to be outraged about inaction on like a global crisis. So that is perfectly coherent emotion to feel. So in those two phases of rationality, school strikers have been perfectly rational.
Yeah, because you wrote in the article, quote, "There's no real way of separating emotions from rationality."
Yeah.
Right? Could you say a bit more about that?
So I guess when you speak about rationality in everyday language and stuff like that, there's very often like some kind of like separation between emotions and what's rational, which goes back to like quite a few philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who saw like inclinations as something that doesn't quite belong to you. It goes further to like Stoics, people like that, but I think Immanuel Kant was probably the most influential modern philosopher who tried to show that we can just like govern ourselves by pure reason, and emotions are just like intrusive things that come in, and that you need to like if you act from emotions, you're not acting morally, you're not acting freely and stuff like that, which is quite an influential view. Lots of people think that if you don't have yourself under control, you're not being rational, but it's a really old-fashioned view on rationality. No psychologist would say that. People in rationality theory would not say that. And there's no clear way. So there's the extreme side, of course, like David Hume, best Scottish philosopher, peak Scottish Enlightenment, would just say like, there's no such thing as like rationality. There's just the passions, there's just the emotions, and we kind of like sometimes balance them out a little bit, but that's really it. But even if you don't go that far, there's a sense of rationality to emotions because they are responding to things, they are intentional objects, they are propositional, and you can't just like separate them into like belief components and feeling components like that.
Yeah, sure.
Sense of them.
I totally follow that. I mean, I think you've definitely convinced me that it's a rational response to feel fear and anger. But what I want to know is about what comes next. I want to know which action is rational.
So I guess that's where the criticism of school strikers comes in, right? Like there's a third type of rationality where that people kind of sneak in through the back door when they talk about like how does it benefit you? How does it lead you towards achieving your goals? How does it lead you to like live your best life, so to say? So that sense of rationality is sometimes clashing with the other two. Like you can be perfectly rational in terms of appropriateness and coherence, but it might not be beneficial to you to like respond in a certain way all the time.
Can we think about an example?
Let's go back to the bear. It might be appropriate for you and coherent to like freeze in pain or like run away, but that might not be the best thing to do for a bear, because the bear would like just like, oh, he's running away, let's eat him. So stuff like that, especially in a political context. If you're angry, if you're really outspoken and outraged, lots of people say that this is not beneficial to your cause because it's alienating people, because it's upsetting people, because it will consume yourself. So in that way can clash with your long-term goals, which is a common criticism of the climate movement. It's a common criticism of anti-racist movements like Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's address it right now. So what do you say to the people who say that fear and anger will create irrational actions?
I think that's incredibly patronizing, because you don't know what's gonna be like a rational action. You don't know what's gonna be a productive pattern of behavior that is established, and people who are upset about these kind of like political structural problems know a lot better very often what will be good for them than people who criticize them for their responses. And this response very often has like an ideological purpose, right? If you don't police people like that, if you say, okay, your outrage like alienates other people from your support, you're prioritizing your own feeling of safety and reasonable, respectful discourse over the political problem that these movements draw attention to.
Can you imagine a case where somebody, the police or the person in power does believe in the cause, let's say the BLM, but still wants to say fear and anger is not going to be most beneficial for both you and us?
So I guess, I don't know, because people who say that we're on the same side, but you shouldn't speak like that, are at least playing into the status quo, at least like trying to like disarm the movement from their responses. Anger and fear often sustains political movements, right? So in that way, it's a really beneficial and productive thing to have. If you don't let it consume you, you can use this anger to fuel your movement, to like stay productive, to motivate you. And that goes back. It's not like high tier philosophy, right? It goes back to like David Hume, like what motivates actions, it's passions, it's emotions, right? And without these kind of like anger responses, fear responses, you won't do things anymore. So in lots of ways, this anger is, and to bring that back to like the school strikers, think of Greta in the very beginning, right? Like Greta reads about climate change somewhere and she's really upset about it, and she goes out, doesn't go to school, and sits in front of Parliament with her shield, which is like super, it's like incredibly weird if you think about it in that moment, right? Like someone who sees that is like, the fuck is this girl doing? But it turned out to be really beneficial for her generation, and for the entire movement, because loads of people shared that response, saw that anger, and joined her in the cause. And I think what critics of like this emotionalization of politics, so people like Martha Nussbaum, who wrote a book, The Monarchy of Fear and stuff, where she says politics is emotionalized and that's a bad thing. They're interested in this form of liberal discourse where you have an institution and all of these people governed by the institution have very like rationally clean responses, but that's not how real politics is like, right? And you can only achieve change when you have a big movement in society, and for that you need an emotional connectedness across like the population to mobilize people for a cause.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And one other thing that's really interested me recently is the discourse in the climate movement around the irreversible tipping point. And I'm just quoting from a website here. What's being talked about is that in 10 or 11 years, there's if we continue as is, then global warming will exceed 1.5 Celsius. However, hearing that there's going to be a tipping point in 10, 11, 12 years is quite a dramatic thing to say. What do you think about using that as a tool in the movement?
So it's complicated, right? Because it really drives home the urgency of the climate crisis, and it shows how little time we have left to like actually prevent catastrophic climate breakdown, and which is motivating, which will outrage people and bring them to the streets. So I think it's important to like drive this point home and to hold governments and corporations to account that they're failing this kind of to reach this kind of tipping point, which is scientifically backed up by the IPCC report, right? On the other hand, of course, it's difficult because it can lead to a kind of fatalism in the movement that you see, okay, we have like this super restricted time frame where we have to change the entire economic and political system. We most likely won't succeed, so why not just sit back and stay on the couch and not do nothing? So there's two sides to it. And
I suppose we've been alluding to actual political movements about climate change, and in the second half we should probably talk about climate change movements. One that you were involved in was Extinction Rebellion. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what Extinction Rebellion is for those who don't know, and where it started and where it is now.
So Extinction Rebellion is a climate organization that tried to rally as many people to the streets as possible with very dramatic methods, with like dressing up, with lots of dramatic shows of like spilling blood everywhere, singing, and all that kind of stuff. And they had like 3 asks from the government. So what differed from Extinction Rebellion from other climate movements like Ende Gelände in Germany, for example, or the school strikers, is that they only addressed the government, and they asked the government to like act now and tell the truth. They wanted carbon neutrality by 2025, and they wanted citizens' assembly to replace the current forms of governance. And they've been fairly successful in the UK in mobilizing thousands, like hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets, mostly in London, but also in Scotland. There's a strong presence in Extinction Rebellion Scotland.
Yeah. Now you were a working group coordinator at Extinction Rebellion Scotland, or the
Bit
coordinator.
later, yeah.
But you were involved, but you are no longer. I mean, I wonder what you think is good about Extinction Rebellion's approach, but also whether you have any sort of open questions for Extinction Rebellion.
So Extinction Rebellion, so there's quite a lot of good things about Extinction Rebellion. Like, mobilizing so many people to the cause is excellent. I think what is particularly good about Extinction Rebellion is that they try to open up about emotions felt towards climate change, which opens up like a good conversation of how we should feel when there's an impending crisis that will hurt so many people. And I hope that Extinction Rebellion continues their work, but there's a lot of open questions, of course. So one of the deeper issues I see with Extinction Rebellion is that Extinction Rebellion makes climate change into a moral problem, which it is to some extent, right? But climate change is also a political problem. Climate change is about political structures, it's about inequalities, it's about a system perpetuating injustices. And Extinction Rebellion takes that and says, you need to act now. It's your moral duty to act on the climate crisis. That kind of that works in mobilizing lots of people, right? Because lots of people feel like a moral duty to act on climate change. But what I see as a risk of this moralizing strategy of a political problem is that people get demobilized afterwards, that they feel like they're burnt out, they have failed morally to prevent this crisis, so they're just gonna go home and feel guilty about it, which is not helpful at all, right? You shouldn't feel guilty because it's morally speaking, it's not your fault, right? You might have moral responsibility to some extent to the climate crisis because you're trapped in a system that forces you to consume in a bad way and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean that you should feel guilty about being a moral failure for not personally solving climate change. And that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, and okay, that makes perfect sense. And I'll just bring up one or two other criticisms I found on the Wikipedia page of Extinction Rebellion. You can comment on them if you want to. They talk about Extinction Rebellion using unrealistic time frames, and according to the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, the Extinction Rebellion is an ambition that technically, economically and politically has absolutely no chance of being fulfilled. And there's also the class and race stuff, isn't there?
So for the first thing, of course they'd say that, right? I mean, unrealistic demands should not be the criticism that people focus on, because of course it's going to be unrealistic to achieve carbon neutrality of an entire country to 2025, but that's not what it's about. If you place an outrageous demand, it will shift the political conversation in a certain direction, so it is a strategic thing to use. With the other thing, that's more complicated, right? The intersectionality and racism and classism critique, I think, is accurate. The way environmentalists organize is very often alienating to people of color, to working class people, it's quite inaccessible to people with disabilities, and it is not new. That should also be said. Like, lots of people in that conservationist movement have been quite racist, and they're always like upper middle class historically. So there should be no surprise that these elements are still in big climate movements. And other movements have done work to criticize that and reflect on these kind of things, and Extinction Rebellion is in a process of doing so. I hope, at least. I know that is to some extent true for Extinction Rebellion Scotland. I can't speak to other Extinction Rebellion movements like Extinction Rebellion UK. But yeah, and that's something that they need to work on. I guess lots of the criticisms need to be dealt with to make the movement evolve, right? And political movement is always about like educating people in that movement on the issues, and I think there's like unproductive criticism, right? There's like criticism that you should just ignore. There's always like trolls and political movements who try to derail things, but there's a difference between derailing the debate within a movement and getting it off target, and drawing concerns about systematic problems within a movement. And I think these things should be listened to, right? Because you will need a broad support that fights for like a broader sense of justice. You don't fix climate change by just reducing emissions, right? There's a broader debate about it, especially if you want what is called a just transition, when you want to like transition to a carbon-free economy in a way that doesn't harm communities, doesn't harm workers. Then you need to take a lot of communities with you, and then you need to organize in a way that that reaches out to working class people, to workers in the oil and gas industry, for example, to people of color, to communities in the global south. And it's also important to recognize why climate change is so bad, right? You can't get a sense of why climate change is so bad without actually seeing the most vulnerable communities being hit by the climate crisis. So so this is the opposite of derailing the movement, right? If you say you need to think more about indigenous communities in the global south, that is not derailing it. It's more it's bringing the climate movement more on target, because these people are being killed right now and are those worst hit by the climate crisis, but also have the most solutions to the climate crisis by protecting forests and preserving their way of life.
Okay, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Been really fun talking to you. I'm gonna let you plug now. Do you have any? You're obviously involved in climate change political action in Glasgow. What could Glasgow University students do if they were interested in doing something in Glasgow?
You should join a political movement. There's a lot of things to do. If you're interested in climate issues, go to Extinction Rebellion's Glasgow meetings, join Glasgow Calls Out Polluters, help the school strikers. If you're interested in race issues, there's lots of migrant justice organizations you can help out. For example, More Migrants Organizing for Rights and Empowerment, a great organization. Yeah, Glasgow is an incredibly political city, and you should take part in that. And when the COP26 comes to Glasgow next year, I'm gonna see you on the street, hopefully.
Brilliant. Yeah, that was amazing.